There is a moment in diplomacy when silence speaks louder than any signed agreement, and what just happened between Washington and Beijing is one of those moments that history will remember. Not for what was said, but for what was deliberately left unsaid. Trump landed in the Middle East, riding a wave of deal-making momentum. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE. The optics were extraordinary. Hundreds of billions in pledged investments, handshakes, sword dances, and the kind of pageantry that fills a 24-hour news cycle for weeks. But then came Beijing's response, quiet, measured, and absolutely devastating in its precision. Xi Jinping didn't need to raise his voice, he never does. The message was delivered through channels that most Western analysts are only beginning to decode, and the core of that message was this: there will be no Iran deal that China does not sanction, and Washington does not get to restructure the Middle East while simultaneously waging economic war on Beijing. That is the story hiding behind the headlines, and if you stay with me through this conversation, I am going to show you exactly why this moment is far more consequential than anything the mainstream commentators are willing to admit. Let me take you behind the curtain to understand what really happened when Trump left Beijing without an Iran deal, or more precisely, without the geopolitical architecture necessary to make any Iran deal stick. We have to step back and look at the broader chessboard, not the chessboard that cable news shows you, which is a flat, two-dimensional board with America always positioned at the center. I'm talking about the three-dimensional chessboard that operates through energy corridors, currency agreements, military posture, and the slow grinding realignment of civilizational loyalties. That is the board Xi Jinping is playing on. And frankly, it is the board that Trump, whatever his instincts may be, is being constantly pulled away from by the institutional forces surrounding him. Now, the critical realization I want you to hold in your mind, and I will fully unpack this in the final third of our conversation today, is that the Iran question is not primarily about nuclear weapons. It never has been, not in the deepest strategic sense. The Iran question is about who controls the energy architecture of the 21st century and whether the dollar remains the instrument through which that architecture is governed. Once you understand that, every diplomatic failure, every sanction regime, every military posture in the Persian Gulf snaps into focus with extraordinary clarity. So hold that thought. We are going to come back to it, and when we do, I think it will reframe everything you thought you understood about Washington's Iran policy. But to understand why this matters, we have to look at where Trump's Middle East trip actually succeeded, because the successes are real and they are significant, and dismissing them would be intellectually dishonest. Saudi Arabia's commitment, and I use that word with full awareness of how Saudi commitments have historically aged, represented an enormous symbolic realignment. The Abraham Accords architecture, which began in Trump's first term, was always about more than normalization between Israel and a handful of Gulf states. It was about creating an alternative regional security architecture that would theoretically reduce American dependence on direct military intervention while keeping Washington at the center of regional deal-making. The vision, in its most optimistic form, was a Middle East where American capital, American technology, and American diplomatic imprimatur would substitute for American boots on the ground. That vision has a certain elegant logic to it, and in Riyadh and Doha, Trump was selling that vision with the considerable force of his personality and his transactional genius. He understands leverage in the commercial sense better than almost any president in recent memory. He knows how to make a counterpart feel that they are getting a historic deal, that they are being elevated, that America is choosing them specifically. These are real skills. They produce real results in certain environments. But here is where the architecture begins to fracture. The entire Middle Eastern realignment that Washington is pursuing, whether we are talking about the normalization of Saudi-Israeli relations, the containment of Iranian influence, or the integration of Gulf capital into American financial markets, every single one of these objectives runs directly through Beijing's sphere of influence in ways that were simply not true a decade ago. China is now Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner. China is the primary destination for Iranian oil, purchased at discounts that sustain Tehran's economy despite decades of Western sanctions. China brokered the historic Saudi-Iranian rapprochement in 2023, a diplomatic achievement that stunned Washington precisely because it demonstrated that Beijing could operate as a serious mediating power in a region that America had considered its exclusive domain since the end of the Cold War. So when Trump arrives in the region talking about an Iran deal, talking about a new regional order, talking about investment flows and technology partnerships, Xi Jinping is watching from Beijing with the calm detachment of someone who understands that the foundations of his own strategic position are embedded in the very problems Trump is trying to solve. Iran is not a problem that can be solved over Beijing's objections. That is the geopolitical reality. And Xi's message, delivered not through dramatic press conferences, but through the quiet maintenance of China's economic relationships with Tehran, through China's continued opposition to escalated sanctions, through Beijing's ongoing role as the indispensable back channel, that message is unmistakable to anyone who speaks the language of great power competition. And I want to ask you something directly, because I think this is a question worth sitting with. When you look at the trajectory of American foreign policy over the last 30 years, the expansion of NATO, the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, the maximum pressure campaigns, the endless cycle of sanctions and military posturing, do you see a coherent strategic vision? Or do you see an institution that has become so captured by its own internal logic that it can no longer distinguish between the performance of power and the actual exercise of it? I ask this not to be provocative, but because I think the honest answer to that question explains more about where we are today than any individual policy decision. The institutional architecture of American foreign policy, the State Department, the intelligence community, the vast network of think tanks and advisory bodies that shape the acceptable range of options, this architecture has certain deep structural commitments that transcend individual administrations. One of those commitments is the containment of any power or coalition of powers that might challenge dollar hegemony. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the openly acknowledged strategic objective of multiple American administrations, articulated in documents like the Wolfowitz Doctrine, embedded in the logic of the petrodollar system that Henry Kissinger architected in the 1970s, and visible in the pattern of American military intervention whenever a major oil producer has attempted to trade energy in currencies other than the dollar. Iran represents a direct challenge to this architecture, not primarily because of its nuclear program, though that provides a useful and emotionally resonant justification, but because Iran sits at the junction of enormous energy reserves and a geopolitical orientation that is explicitly resistant to dollar-denominated trade. Iran trades with China in yuan. Iran is a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran participates in the BRICS expansion that is slowly, methodically constructing an alternative financial architecture that does not require the dollar as an intermediary. Every day that Iran remains outside the Western financial system and inside the emerging Chinese-led alternative system is a data point that other nations observe and learn from. And here is where Xi's message to Trump becomes not just diplomatic posturing, but a statement of fundamental strategic interest. China does not want Iran reintegrated into the Western financial system on Western terms. This is not because Beijing is ideologically committed to Iranian governance, or because Xi has personal warmth for the clerical establishment in Tehran. It is because a Western-compliant Iran would close off one of Beijing's most important energy corridors, remove a significant source of below-market oil that sustains Chinese industrial competitiveness, and most importantly, demonstrate that American maximum pressure campaigns ultimately work, which would give Washington a playbook it could deploy against any number of countries that are currently drifting toward the Chinese orbit. So when we talk about Trump leaving Beijing without an Iran deal, we are really talking about something much more fundamental. We are talking about the limits of transactional diplomacy when it encounters structural strategic opposition from a power that has both the patience and the resources to simply wait out American pressure cycles. Trump's genius is in closing deals. But you cannot close a deal when the most important party at the table has a strategic interest in the deal not closing. And Xi Jinping, in this particular case, is that party. But to understand why this matters for the average American watching this right now, we have to connect it to something much closer to home. Because the temptation, when we talk about great power competition and energy architecture and dollar hegemony, is to treat these as abstract concerns of the foreign policy establishment. Interesting to discuss, but ultimately remote from the lived experience of someone paying rent in Cleveland or running a small business in Phoenix. That is a temptation we should resist because the connection is direct and it is consequential. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency is not a natural law. It is a political achievement maintained through a combination of military power, financial infrastructure, and the deeply embedded habits of global commerce. When countries trade oil in dollars, they need to hold dollars. When they hold dollars, they buy American Treasury bonds. When they buy American treasury bonds, they finance American government spending at interest rates lower than any other nation on earth could achieve. This subsidy, and it is an enormous, invisible subsidy, is what allows the American government to run the kind of deficits that would collapse any other currency. It is what allows the American consumer to import far more than America exports year after year, decade after decade, without triggering the kind of currency crisis that would devastate any other economy. The threat to this system is not Russian tanks or Chinese missiles. The threat is a gradual, patient, transactional rewiring of global commerce away from dollar intermediation. Every yuan-denominated oil sale, every BRICS currency basket discussion, every bilateral trade agreement that bypasses the SWIFT system is a small erosion of the foundation on which American living standards rest. And the Iran deal, or more precisely the failure to achieve it on American terms, is a signal that this erosion is continuing, that Beijing has chosen to protect the alternative architecture rather than accommodate Washington's desire to bring Iran back into the dollar system. Now I want to pause here and ask you another question because I think the answer will reveal something important about the moment we are in. If you were Xi Jinping sitting in Zhongnanhai watching the United States simultaneously impose tariffs on Chinese goods, threaten Chinese technology companies, conduct military exercises in the South China Sea, and attempt to negotiate a Middle Eastern realignment that would serve American strategic interests, would you make concessions on Iran? I put this to you not as a rhetorical trick, but as a genuine exercise in strategic empathy, because the failure to engage in that empathy is, I believe, the single greatest deficiency in mainstream American foreign policy analysis. Strategic empathy does not mean agreeing with Beijing's objectives. It does not mean accepting the legitimacy of China's authoritarian governance or its expansive territorial claims. It simply means understanding that your counterpart has interests, has a strategic logic, has red lines, and that ignoring those realities does not make them disappear. It simply guarantees that your diplomatic initiatives will fail in predictable ways, and the Iran diplomacy is failing in a very predictable way for reasons that anyone with genuine strategic literacy could have foreseen. But to understand why this matters, we have to look at the domestic American context, because there is a pressure dynamic operating inside Washington that is pulling the Iran policy in directions that are strategically counterproductive but politically convenient. The institutional forces within the American national security establishment, and I am being deliberate and careful here, because these are not monolithic actors but a constellation of interests that sometimes align and sometimes conflict, these forces have a deep structural commitment to the continued isolation of Iran, not necessarily because isolation serves American strategic interests in the present moment, but because reversing 30 years of maximum pressure policy requires someone to absorb the political cost of appearing to reward Iranian defiance. No institution willingly accepts that kind of cost. No career official wants to be the person who recommended the policy reversal that subsequently went wrong. This is the bureaucratic trap that surrounds any American president who attempts to pursue a genuinely different Iran strategy. Trump, in his first term, tore up the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, in 2018 under pressure from advisors like John Bolton and with strong encouragement from Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Gulf states. That decision locked in a maximum pressure posture that has since failed to achieve any of its stated objectives. Iran's nuclear program has advanced significantly since 2018. Iran's integration into the Chinese and Russian economic sphere has deepened. Iran's regional influence, far from being curtailed, has expanded through its network of proxy relationships across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. The maximum pressure campaign has been a strategic failure by almost any honest measure, and yet, and this is the remarkable thing, the institutional momentum behind that policy remains powerful. Because within the Washington foreign policy ecosystem, the question is not simply whether a policy works. The question is whether the policy serves the interests of the institutional actors who designed and defended it. Sanctions regimes employ armies of lawyers, compliance officers, and enforcement personnel. The Iran file generates enormous consulting revenues, think tank funding, and congressional attention. There is an entire political economy built around the maintenance of maximum pressure, and that political economy does not simply dissolve because the policy is not working. Trump's instincts, interestingly, are in some tension with this institutional momentum. He is, at his core, a deal maker. He wants visible wins. He wants to be the president who solved the Iran problem, just as Nixon was the president who opened China. There is genuine personal motivation there, and it is worth taking seriously. But wanting a deal and being able to close a deal are very different things when the structural obstacles are this formidable. Beijing's refusal to provide meaningful cooperation on Iran diplomacy is not the only obstacle. There is also the question of what Iran itself would accept, the domestic political constraints in Tehran, the Israeli red lines that any American administration must navigate, and the Gulf states' complicated relationship with Iranian regional power. What Xi's stark message, to use the framing of the headline, really communicates is that China is not going to simplify this equation for Washington. Beijing is not going to pressure Tehran into concessions. Beijing is not going to reduce its oil purchases from Iran. Beijing is not going to endorse a new regional security architecture that places American interests above Chinese ones. And Beijing is doing all of this not through dramatic confrontation, but through the simple maintenance of existing relationships, which is in many ways the most powerful form of strategic communication available. Now let me bring you to the critical realization I promised to unpack, because I think it changes the frame of this entire discussion in a way that is genuinely important. We have been speaking as though the Iran deal is a discrete diplomatic objective, something that can be achieved or not achieved based on negotiating skill and political will. But the deeper truth is that the Iran deal in its current iteration is fundamentally a proxy battle over the architecture of the post-dollar world. Washington's Iran policy is not primarily about preventing nuclear proliferation. It is about maintaining the energy pricing system that undergirds dollar hegemony. And Beijing's opposition to that policy is not primarily about protecting an ally. It is about ensuring that the alternative financial architecture, the one that China has been patiently constructing through the Belt and Road Initiative, through yuan internationalization, through BRICS expansion, continues to have the energy supply chains and the participating economies it needs to become a genuine alternative to the Bretton Woods system. This is the real game being played, and it is a game where the traditional tools of American diplomacy, sanctions, military pressure, bilateral negotiations, are becoming progressively less effective, not because America is weak, but because the structural conditions that made those tools effective are eroding. When every major economy was integrated into the dollar system, dollar sanctions were existentially threatening. When most oil was priced in dollars, energy diplomacy ran through Washington. When the American consumer market was the indispensable destination for export-driven economies, access to America was a strategic necessity. These conditions no longer hold as absolutely as they once did. And the Iran situation is one of the most vivid illustrations of that shift. China's economy is now larger than America's on a purchasing power parity basis. China is the primary trading partner of more countries than the United States. The yuan's share of global trade finance is growing slowly but consistently. The SWIFT system, once the unchallenged backbone of global financial communication, now has a Chinese alternative, CIPS, that processes a growing volume of international transactions. None of these developments is individually decisive, but collectively, they represent a structural shift in the global economic order that is making the instruments of American financial coercion progressively less potent. And here is where the human dimension of this story becomes important, because it is easy to discuss these structural shifts in abstract terms and lose sight of the fact that they have direct consequences for real people. When Iran cannot be brought back into the Western financial system because Beijing has made that strategically impossible, the result is not some abstract geopolitical stalemate. The result is continued tension in the Persian Gulf, continued risk of military miscalculation, continued suffering of the Iranian population under sanctions, and continued erosion of American credibility as a diplomatic actor capable of delivering on its commitments. The people who pay the price for these strategic failures are not sitting in think tanks in Washington. They are ordinary people in Tehran and in American cities alike, living with the consequences of a geopolitical competition they barely have a framework to understand. I want to ask one more question before bringing this to a close. Is there a version of American Iran policy that acknowledges China's strategic interests, creates a real off-ramp for Tehran, and still protects the security concerns of Washington, Jerusalem, and Riyadh? I believe the answer is yes, but it requires a level of strategic honesty the current American foreign policy establishment is not yet capable of. It requires admitting that maximum pressure has failed, accepting that China is now a permanent part of the Middle Eastern strategic landscape, and engaging Tehran as a rational actor with legitimate interests rather than simply a rogue state to be coerced. Trump has the instincts for transactional pragmatism that could break through some of these constraints. He lacks the ideological attachment to the liberal international order that shaped Obama's Iran diplomacy and much of the foreign policy establishment. That is useful. But instinct without strategic architecture is not enough. A real Iran breakthrough requires patient, multilateral diplomacy that cannot be improvised through high-profile meetings. It requires engaging Beijing not just as a trade rival, but as a stakeholder whose cooperation is necessary for any durable Middle Eastern settlement. Xi's message in the end is not really directed at Trump personally. It is directed at the American system. It is saying, you cannot restructure this region without us. You cannot solve the Iran problem while treating China as a rival to be contained and simultaneously expecting its cooperation on issues vital to American interests. That message is uncomfortable because it challenges assumptions born during the unipolar era, an era that, whether Washington fully accepts it or not, has already ended. But uncomfortable messages are often the most important ones, and the leaders able to hear them clearly, without filtering them through ideology or institutional habit, are the ones most likely to navigate the coming decades successfully. The chessboard has changed. The pieces have changed. The players have changed. What has not changed enough is the strategic imagination of the institutions making decisions in Washington. Until that changes, moments like this, diplomatic initiatives launched without the structure to sustain them, rival powers quietly asserting influence without direct confrontation, will continue repeating themselves. The question is no longer whether America has the power to impose its will. The real question is whether it has the wisdom to recognize when the use of that power is becoming counterproductive. And that may be the defining strategic question of our time. There is a moment in diplomacy when silence speaks louder than any signed agreement, and what just happened between Washington and Beijing is one of those moments that history will remember. Not for what was said, but for what was deliberately left unsaid. Trump landed in the Middle East, riding a wave of deal-making momentum. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE. The optics were extraordinary. Hundreds of billions in pledged investments, handshakes, sword dances, and the kind of pageantry that fills a 24-hour news cycle for weeks. But then came Beijing's response, quiet, measured, and absolutely devastating in its precision. Xi Jinping didn't need to raise his voice. He never does. The message was delivered through channels that most Western analysts are only beginning to decode, and the core of that message was this: there will be no Iran deal that China does not sanction, and Washington does not get to restructure the Middle East while simultaneously waging economic war on Beijing. That is the story hiding behind the headlines, and if you stay with me through this conversation, I am going to show you exactly why this moment is far more consequential than anything the mainstream commentators are willing to admit. Let me take you behind the curtain to understand what really happened when Trump left Beijing without an Iran deal, or more precisely, without the geopolitical architecture necessary to make any Iran deal stick. We have to step back and look at the broader chessboard, not the chessboard that cable news shows you, which is a flat, two-dimensional board with America always positioned at the center. I'm talking about the three-dimensional chessboard that operates through energy corridors, currency agreements, military posture, and the slow grinding realignment of civilizational loyalties. That is the board Xi Jinping is playing on. And frankly, it is the board that Trump, whatever his instincts may be, is being constantly pulled away from by the institutional forces surrounding him. Now, the critical realization I want you to hold in your mind, and I will fully unpack this in the final third of our conversation today, is that the Iran question is not primarily about nuclear weapons. It never has been, not in the deepest strategic sense. The Iran question is about who controls the energy architecture of the 21st century and whether the dollar remains the instrument through which that architecture is governed. Once you understand that, every diplomatic failure, every sanction regime, every military posture in the Persian Gulf snaps into focus with extraordinary clarity. So hold that thought. We are going to come back to it, and when we do, I think it will reframe everything you thought you understood about Washington's Iran policy. But to understand why this matters, we have to look at where Trump's Middle East trip actually succeeded, because the successes are real and they are significant, and dismissing them would be intellectually dishonest. Saudi Arabia's commitment, and I use that word with full awareness of how Saudi commitments have historically aged, represented an enormous symbolic realignment. The Abraham Accords architecture, which began in Trump's first term, was always about more than normalization between Israel and a handful of Gulf states. It was about creating an alternative regional security architecture that would theoretically reduce American dependence on direct military intervention while keeping Washington at the center of regional deal-making. The vision, in its most optimistic form, was a Middle East where American capital, American technology, and American diplomatic imprimatur would substitute for American boots on the ground. That vision